The scent of roasted coffee and fresh paper always felt like safety to me. It was Saturday, our ritual, a corner of the world where I wasn't just a struggling single mother, but an explorer alongside my 6-year-old, Oliver. He was bouncing on his toes, clutching his allowance for the latest Dog Man release. I never imagined this sanctuary would turn into a battlefield. As I later told my lawyer, I was buying books with my son when my ex-husband and his new wife walked in, and my son's words broke him. The atmosphere shifted before I even saw them. The air grew colder, sharper. I turned, praying my instincts were wrong, but there he stood. Blake looked like a magazine cover in a charcoal coat, his Rolex catching the harsh fluorescent light. Beside him was Sienna, glowing with the kind of expensive beauty that suggests a life without burdens. My breath hitched in my throat. For a split second, I forgot how to move, my worn sneakers suddenly feeling like lead weights against the carpet. Blake's eyes traveled over me, dismantling my confidence with surgical precision. He took in my thrift store sweater and messy bun with a smirk that was equal parts pity and disgust. "So, this is the woman." He laughed, the sound jarring against the hushed quiet of the aisle. Sienna tilted her head, her gaze sharpening with thinly veiled curiosity, as if I were a zoo exhibit. "She looks tired," she whispered, loud enough for me to hear. I opened my mouth, but my voice died. Oliver tugged my hand, his small fingers trembling against my palm. He looked from the towering man to me, his brow furrowed in confusion. Blake stepped closer, his presence looming over us like a storm cloud, expecting us to shrink away. But Oliver didn't shrink. He stepped forward, his voice piercing the tense silence with heartbreaking clarity. "Mommy?" he asked, staring up at Blake. "Is that the daddy you cried about in the kitchen?" The words sliced through the air like shattered glass. Every sound in the bookstore seemed to vanish. Blake's smirk evaporated, replaced by a flash of pale shock. Shoppers nearby stopped browsing, their heads turning toward the drama unfolding in the children's section. Blake recovered quickly, his jaw tightening as he cleared his throat. He looked down at my son with cold eyes. "I think you're confused, kid," he muttered, his voice dripping with condescension. "You don't know what you are talking about." He moved to step past us, dismissing Oliver entirely. Before I could pull Oliver back, a shadow fell over us. A stranger stepped out from the adjacent aisle, blocking Blake's path. He wasn't wearing a suit, just a dark wool coat. But he held himself with an authority that made Blake pause. "The boy asked you a question," the man said, his voice low and dangerous. Blake blinked, startled by the intrusion. "Excuse me," he snapped. The stranger didn't flinch. I said, "Answer him." The balance of power shifted instantly. The automatic doors slid shut behind us, cutting off the warmth of the bookstore. Outside, the winter air hit with a crisp sting that made my eyes water instantly. I zipped Oliver's jacket higher around his chin, my hands trembling uncontrollably as we walked. Grant walked beside us, his presence a silent, moving wall against the world. He didn't speak, but his pace matched Oliver's small steps perfectly. We reached my old Toyota under the flickering street lamp. It looked fragile in the pale light. "Mommy," Oliver whispered, clutching his new book against his chest like a shield. Did I make the bad man mad? The question twisted a knife deep in my chest. I opened the back door and knelt to face him. forcing a smile I didn't feel. No, baby. You were brave. You were perfect. I buckled him in quickly, kneading him behind safety glass. He looked small in the back seat, staring out the window. I closed the door, my breath fogging in the cold. Grant stood a few feet away, giving me space but not leaving. He watched the parking lot entrance, with the alertness of a soldier on watch. You don't look okay, he said softly, his hands deep in his dark coat pockets. I leaned against the cold metal of the car door, trying to steady my legs. I am fine, I lied, wiping my damp cheeks with my sleeve. You are not, he countered without judgment. The honesty in his voice almost broke the dam. Before I could respond, a sleek black Mercedes swerved into the row, tires screeching against the asphalt. My stomach dropped. Blake. He slammed the car into park and stormed out, leaving his driver's door wide open. His face was flushed, stripped of the polished arrogance he wore inside the store. Caroline! He barked, using my middle name just to sting. We aren't done talking. I instinctively moved to block the rear window, shielding Oliver from the sight of his father's rage. Grant stepped forward immediately, placing himself firmly between the Mercedes and my sedan. Blake ignored him, pointing a shaking finger directly at me. You had no right to humiliate me in there, he hissed, glancing around for witnesses. Do you have any idea what a scene like that does to my reputation? I let out a bitter laugh. You care about your reputation more than your son. Blake's jaw tightened, his eyes darting to Grant with sudden, sharp suspicion. Who is this guy? Blake spat, looking Grant up and down with sneering jealousy. Some nobody trying to play hero. Grant didn't flinch. He didn't even raise his voice. I am someone who knows a bully when I see one, he said evenly. And I know you walked away from your family. Blake stepped closer, fists clenched. Watch your mouth, or I'll make you regret it. The threat hung in the freezing air, heavy and foolish. Grant just stared him down. Go home, Hudson, Grant said, using Blake's last name with strange familiarity. Before you say something that costs you more than just an afternoon. Blake froze. The confidence drained from his face as he processed the tone, the lack of fear, the subtle command. He looked from Grant to me, then muttered a curse and retreated to his car. As he sped off, Grant turned to me. Men like him only understand leverage, he murmured. And he has plenty to lose. The drive home was a blur of passing streetlights and heavy silence. Oliver fell asleep in the back seat, clutching his new book against his chest like a talisman. Inside our small apartment, the quiet felt heavy rather than peaceful. I carried him to bed, tucking the duvet around his small shoulders, grateful he could escape into dreams. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen, a lonely sound that usually comforted me. Tonight, it just sounded like waiting. I poured a glass of water, my hands still shaking. My phone buzzed against the laminate countertop, the vibration sounding like a drill in the stillness. An unknown number flashed on the screen. I stared at it, dread pooling in my stomach, but instinct told me to answer. Hello. A pause, then a voice smooth as polished glass. Caroline, it's Blake. My blood ran cold, freezing me in place. Why are you calling? I whispered, glancing anxiously toward Oliver's bedroom door. We need to talk, he said, his tone clipped. I didn't handle things well. That is an understatement. I snapped, gripping the phone tight enough to crack the case. He exhaled sharply, a sound of staged patience that made my skin crawl. Look, I want to see Oliver. Tomorrow, noon. I closed my eyes, leaning heavily against the counter for support. You had 6 years to want that, Blake. He ignored the jab entirely. Sienna thinks it would be good for everyone if I spent time with him. For my image. There it was. The ugly truth. No, I said, my voice steadying with a sudden surge of protective anger. You don't get to walk in and out, because your wife needs a prop for social media. Silence crackled on the line, thick with his disbelief that I would defy him. This isn't optional, Caroline. I have rights. You forfeited those rights when you left us on the floor. I countered. Do not come here. I ended the call before he could respond. The silence rushed back, suffocating and terrifying. I pressed my palms to my eyes, trying to breathe, when a soft knock rattled the front door. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. Had Blake followed us? I crept to the peephole, ready to dial 911. Instead, I saw a dark wool coat and a brown paper bag. I opened the door just a crack. Grant stood there, looking tired but calm. You didn't eat dinner, he said simply, lifting the bag from a deli down the street. I was in the neighborhood. He wasn't in the neighborhood. We both knew it. But the lie was a kindness I desperately needed. I opened the door wider, stepping back to let him in. He didn't impose. He just occupied the space with a grounding gravity that made the room feel safer. He set the food on the small table and looked at me, really looked at me. He called, didn't he? Grant asked. It wasn't a guess. He read the tension in my shoulders like a map. He wants to see Oliver for his image. I whispered, shame burning my cheeks. Grant's expression darkened, a storm passing behind his eyes. That sounds like Hudson, he murmured. Desperate men make sloppy mistakes. He opened a container of soup, the steam rising between us. His shipping company, Atlas Freight, is under investigation. He needs a family man persona to survive the audit. I stared at him. Grant wasn't just a stranger. He was a weapon I didn't know how to use. The Sunday morning sun felt intrusive, glaring off the cereal bowls I was rinsing. I hadn't slept more than an hour. My mind replaying Grant's warning about Atlas Freight and the lengths a desperate man might go to. Then, a heavy fist hammered against the door, rattling the chain in its frame. My stomach plummeted. I glanced at Oliver, who froze mid-chew, his spoon dripping milk onto the table. Stay here, I whispered, wiping my wet hands on my jeans. I walked to the door. I cracked the door an inch, leaving the security chain engaged. Go away, Blake. He didn't blink, his face tight with sleepless irritation and manic energy. Open the door, Caroline. I am not playing games. Before I could react, he slammed his shoulder against the wood. The chain snapped tight, straining the screws, and I flinched back. I am calling 911. I warned, my voice shaking. And tell them what? He sneered through the gap. That a father wants to see his son. He shoved again. I fumbled to undo the latch, terrified he would break the door down and traumatize Oliver even further. As soon as the metal slid free, Blake pushed past me, bringing the smell of expensive cologne and stale aggression into our sanctuary. He scanned the living room with disdain, his eyes landing on the peeling paint near the ceiling. This is where you keep him, he scoffed, kicking a toy car aside. hardly an environment for a growing boy. His judgment felt like a physical slap. "Oliver!" Blake's voice boomed, far too loud for the small space. My son scrambled off his chair, retreating behind the partition wall that separated the kitchenette. He peeked out, one eye wide with absolute terror. "Come here," Blake commanded, extending a hand that looked more like a claw than an invitation. "Stop hiding. It's rude." I stepped between them, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "He's scared of you," I said, standing my ground. "Leave him alone." Blake stepped around me, his patience snapping. "You are poisoning him against me. I'll have a court order by noon." He reached for Oliver's arm. "Don't touch him." A deep voice rumbled from the hallway. Blake spun around, nearly losing his balance. Grant leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, looking entirely at home in my defense. He hadn't left. He had stayed on the couch all night, a silent sentry. Blake's face went white. "You again," he spat. "Get out of my house." Grant pushed off the wall, moving with a predator's grace. "I don't think I will," he said calmly. "But you should probably leave, Blake. Especially with the auditors crawling all over Atlas Freight tomorrow morning." The color drained from Blake's face, so fast he looked gray. "How do you?" He trailed off, eyes darting. "Employee misconduct is a messy thing," Grant continued, stepping closer until he towered over my ex-husband. "Adding a domestic disturbance charge won't help your case." Blake looked at Grant, really looked at him, and I saw the moment fear replaced anger. He realized Grant wasn't just a bystander. He was a player in a game Blake was losing. He straightened his coat, trying to salvage a shred of dignity. "This isn't over," he hissed at me, avoiding Oliver's gaze entirely. He backed out the door and slammed it shut. I exhaled, shaking, but Grant didn't relax. "He's running," Grant murmured. "But he'll be back when he gets desperate." The library was supposed to be my safe harbor. I focused on the rhythmic thud and slide of returning hardcovers to the shelves, trying to drown out the memory of Blake's fist on my door. The smell of dust and laminate usually calmed me, but today it felt suffocating. I jumped when the intercom crackled overhead, calling my name with a static hiss. The student aide glanced at me with wide eyes. "Mrs. Miller wants you," she whispered. My stomach turned over. The walk to the principal's office felt like a march to the gallows. The hallways were lined with winter artwork, paper snowflakes that looked sharp enough to cut skin. When I entered, Mrs. Miller didn't offer her usual warm smile or a peppermint from the jar. She sat behind her desk, hands clasped tightly over a manila folder. "Close the door, Julianna," she said, her voice lacking its usual melody. The blinds were drawn, shutting out the weak winter sun. She slid a laptop across the mahogany desk, without looking me in the eye. On the screen was a blurry photo of me, kneeling in Barnes and Noble, my face contorted in what looked like rage, but was actually desperate fear. The caption read, "Unstable staff endangering children." An anonymous parent sent this to the school board this morning. Mrs. Miller explained softly. "They claim you were screaming at your son." The lie was so bold it simply stole my breath. "It's out of context," I pleaded, my hands gripping the edge of the desk. "I was protecting him." Mrs. Miller sighed, looking pained but resolute. "I believe you. But the board has a zero-tolerance policy for these accusations. We have to open an investigation. She slid a form toward me. I need your badge and keys. You are on administrative leave until this is cleared. The metal keys felt like ice as I dropped them onto the wood. I was erased. I sat in my freezing car, staring at the gray dashboard while the engine idled. I had no job, no income, and a rent check due in 3 days. My phone buzzed in my lap, vibrating against my leg like a warning. I picked it up to see a text from a blocked number. You should have learned your place. Next time, it won't be just your job. Sienna. The cruelty was so precise it made me nauseous. A knock on the passenger window made me scream. I whipped around to see Grant standing there, his breath fogging the glass. He didn't look calm today. He looked like a thunderstorm contained in a wool coat. I unlocked the door, and he slid into the seat, bringing the cold air with him. They suspended you, he stated flatly. It wasn't a question. He saw the box of personal items in the back. How did you know? I whispered. He took the phone from my shaking hand and read Sienna's text. His jaw tightened until a muscle near his ear jumped. I didn't just stumble upon you in that bookstore, Julianna, he said, turning to face me. My name is Grant Ellington. I own the publishing group supplying this district's books. He handed the phone back, his eyes burning with a terrifying resolve. They just declared war on the wrong person. And I have ammunition. The school auditorium smelled of floor wax and nervous sweat. I walked in with my head high, though inside I felt like I was crumbling. My suspension badge was gone, but my right to be Oliver's mother wasn't. Grant walked beside me, his stride matching mine, a silent bodyguard against the whispers I knew were circulating. Every parent here probably saw that photo. I squeezed Oliver's hand, so hard I worried I might hurt him, but he just squeezed back. He was ready. I had to be too. We scanned the crowded rows of folding chairs. It was a sea of winter coats and camera tripods. Then I saw them. Blake and Sienna held court in the third row, looking like royalty visiting the peasants. Blake wore a suit that cost more than my car. And Sienna was laughing at something a PTA mom said, her hand resting possessively on Blake's arm. They were performing the role of the perfect family, erasing us with every smile. It made my blood run cold. We tried to move toward the side aisle, hoping to avoid a confrontation, but they were predators who smelled fear. Blake stood up abruptly, blocking our path near the juice table. His smile was tight, a rictus of warning that didn't reach his eyes. You actually showed up, he murmured, stepping into my personal space. The scent of his expensive cologne, once familiar, now triggered a gag reflex. I told you to think about what's best for the boy, he hissed. I pulled Oliver slightly behind my hip, shielding him. He wants to read, Blake. That is what's best. Blake leaned down, his voice dropping to a register that only I could hear. If he goes up there and embarrasses me with some pathetic display, I will sue for full custody on the grounds of emotional instability. The threat landed like a physical blow. He knew my financial situation. He knew about the suspension. He knew he could bury me in legal fees until I suffocated. Sienna stepped forward then, smoothing a non-existent wrinkle on her cashmere scarf. Her eyes were hard shards of glass. Don't be selfish, Julianna, she cooed, loud enough for a nearby teacher to hear the fake concern. We just don't want him to struggle publicly. She leaned closer, her voice turning venomous. You've already lost your job. Do you really want to lose him too? Her manicured nail tapped my arm. A subtle act of dominance that made me want to scream. Grant moved then, breaking the invisible cage they had built around me. He didn't shove Blake, he just stepped into the gap, forcing Blake to stumble back. Touching her is a mistake, Grant said. His voice a low rumble that vibrated in my chest. He looked over Blake's shoulder, locking eyes with Mrs. Miller on the stage. She stiffened, clearly recognizing the man who funded her library. Grant gave a barely perceptible nod to the principal. The dynamic in the cold room shifted instantly. Blake noticed the exchange and frowned, sensing he was missing a critical piece of the puzzle. He looked at Grant, then back at me, uncertainty flickering in his gaze. "This is your last chance," he muttered, though the bravado was slipping. "Take him home." My heart hammered against my ribs. I could leave. I could save Oliver from the potential fallout, and save myself the legal battle. It would be the safe choice. It would be the choice the old Julianna made. I looked down at Oliver. He wasn't looking at Blake. He was clutching his book. The Boy and the Empty Chair, his knuckles white but his jaw set. He wasn't asking to leave. He was waiting for me to be brave. I looked up at Blake, finding a reserve of steel I didn't know I possessed. "No," I said, my voice steady. "We aren't going anywhere. And if you threaten me again, I'll make sure everyone here knows exactly why you are worried." The shock on Blake's face was almost worth the terror. He opened his mouth, but Sienna yanked his sleeve, sensing the turning tide of the room. "Fine," she snapped, pulling him toward their seats. "Let him fail." They retreated, but the air around us still felt charged with static. Grant placed a hand on the small of my back, guiding us to the empty seats in the front row. "You did good," he whispered. My hands were shaking, but my resolve had hardened into concrete. Mrs. Miller tapped the microphone, the feedback whine silencing the room. The lights dimmed, plunging the auditorium into a hush that felt heavy with expectation. I watched Oliver walk up the wooden stairs to the stage, looking so small against the velvet curtain. Blake sat 3 rows back, a shadow waiting to pounce. But as the spotlight hit my son, I knew the time for hiding was over. The story he was about to tell wasn't the one Blake had written for him. Oliver adjusted the microphone stand, the metal squealing against the silence. It was too tall for him. A stark reminder of just how small he really was against the forces trying to crush us. He smoothed the paper of his handwritten book, his fingers trembling slightly under the harsh stage lights. I held my breath, my fingernails digging crescents into my palms. Beside me, Grant leaned forward, his focus absolute. This wasn't just a reading, it was a trial, and my son was the only witness who mattered. "My story is called The Boy and the Empty Chair," Oliver announced, his voice thin but wavering with a strange, new courage. A few parents chuckled politely at the title, expecting a whimsical tale about furniture. Blake, 3 rows back, crossed his arms and checked his phone, visibly bored by the proceedings. He didn't know yet that the ground was about to open up beneath his Italian leather shoes. Oliver turned the first page, the crinkle of paper amplified by the sound system. The room waited. "Once upon a time," Oliver read. "There was a daddy who packed a big suitcase. He looked up, scanning the dark room, until his eyes seemed to land right on Blake. He didn't say goodbye to the boy or the mommy. He just walked out the door, because he didn't want to share his toys. The air in the auditorium changed instantly. The polite smiles on the parents' faces vanished. The temperature dropped as people realized this wasn't fiction. It was a confession. Oliver flipped the page, his voice gaining strength. The boy cried, but the daddy didn't hear him. The daddy liked his shiny watch more than his boy. A collective gasp rippled through the rows. I saw heads turn. Eyes darting from the stage to the man in the third row wearing the flashy Rolex. Blake froze, his phone halfway to his pocket. The indifference on his face shattered, replaced by a dawning horror. He was being unmasked in real time, stripped of every lie he'd told. Blake shot up from his seat, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Okay, that's enough," he barked, his voice cracking with desperation. "Stop this immediately." But the room didn't cower this time. A father in the second row turned around. "Sit down, pal," he snapped. "Let the kid finish." Blake looked around, stunned to find no allies. He glared at me, but Grant shifted in his seat, turning to fix Blake with a look of absolute warning. Blake sank back down, defeated. Oliver didn't stop. He read the final line with a clarity that pierced my heart. The boy waited a long time. But then he learned he didn't need the empty chair. He had his mommy, and she was enough for two. He closed the book. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with the weight of 6 years of pain, finally spoken aloud. I felt tears slide down my face, hot and unbidden. I wasn't the victim anymore. I was the hero of his story. The applause didn't start as a polite golf clap. It erupted like thunder. Parents stood up, cheering not just for the story, but for the bravery it took to tell it. Mrs. Miller was wiping her eyes on stage. I ran to the steps as Oliver descended, catching him in a hug that felt like putting a piece of my soul back in place. Over his shoulder, I saw Blake sitting alone in the cheering crowd, a statue of ruin amidst the noise. We tried to leave, but Blake intercepted us near the exit. He looked wrecked, his hair messy, his tie loosened as if he couldn't breathe. Sienna was nowhere to be seen. She had abandoned the sinking ship. Blake didn't look at me. He dropped to his knees on the linoleum floor, eye level with Oliver. It was a gesture of humility I never thought I'd see. "Oliver," he choked out, his voice raw. "I heard you. I really heard you." The crowd watched, silent witnesses. "I made a mistake," Blake whispered, tears tracking through the spray tan on his cheeks. "I was stupid and selfish. I want to fix it. Please." It sounded real. For the first time in 6 years, the corporate mask was gone, leaving just a broken man realizing what he had thrown away. My heart ached, not for him, but for the time lost. He reached out a hand, trembling, waiting for his son to take it. But some bridges, once burned, cannot be rebuilt. Oliver looked at his father's hand, then up at his face. He didn't look angry anymore. He just looked tired. "I forgive you, Blake," he said softly, using his first name instead of Daddy. "But I don't want to go with you. I want to go home with Mommy." The rejection was absolute. Blake slumped back on his heels, devastation etched into every line of his face. He had lost. I took Oliver's hand, and we walked out into the winter night, leaving the empty chair behind. The black Mercedes tore out of the school lot, leaving skid marks on the salted asphalt. It was the last time I would see that car, with fear tight in my chest. Beside me, Oliver slumped against my hip, his adrenaline crashing into deep exhaustion. The cold air felt different now, cleaner, sharper, stripped of the humidity of panic. Grant stood near the curb, hands deep in his coat pockets, watching the exit like a sentry who had finally seen the enemy retreat. The war was finally over. Grant turned to us, his breath fogging in the twilight. "He won't be back," he said, the certainty in his voice acting as a balm to my frayed nerves. "And if he does, he has no leverage left." I nodded. But reality was creeping in. "I still don't have a job," I admitted, my voice small in the vast winter silence. "I can't fight a custody battle on zero income." Grant smiled then, a genuine expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes, shifting the dynamic. "About that," Grant started, stepping closer but respecting the space between us. "Ellington Publishing is launching a new division for children's literacy. We need someone who understands the impact of stories on young minds, someone brave." He paused, letting the words land. "The position is yours, Julianna. Full benefits, and a salary that ensures you never have to feel small again." Tears pricked my eyes. It wasn't charity. It was a lifeline woven from respect. He wasn't saving me, he was simply handing me a sword. I looked at Oliver, half asleep but safe, and then at Grant. For years, I had apologized for taking up space, trying to make myself invisible to avoid Blake's wrath. That ended today. "I accept," I said, my voice steady and strong. Grant nodded, satisfied. He reached into his messenger bag and pulled out a hardcover book. It had no jacket, just a pristine white cover that caught the fading light. "One more thing," he said softly. "I think you'll need this." I took the book, its weight substantial in my freezing hands. I opened it to find cream-colored pages, completely empty. "A new start," Grant explained, his gaze holding mine with an intensity that promised a future I hadn't dared to imagine. "Write your own ending, Julianna. No one else holds the pen anymore." I ran my thumb over the grain of the paper. The infinite possibility of it, it was terrifying and exhilarating. I wasn't just a character in Blake's tragedy anymore. I was finally the author. We walked to my battered Toyota, moving as a unit. As I buckled Oliver in, I looked back at the library windows. I realized how far we had traveled since that morning. I was buying books with my son when my ex-husband and his new wife walked in, and my son's words broke him, but they also healed me. I climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine roared to life, sounding less like a struggle and more like a beginning.